If you're a fan of mysteries, a lover of the hard-boiled, a fanatic of noir, if you crave a story about the human condition, then do I have a story for you. But it's nothing compared to the stories they had for you. Case number 16, The Strand and the Black Mask, Pulp Magazine Legends, today on the Noir Factory.
Noir, suspense, true crime, hard-boiled fiction. Explore the dark alleys and cheap gin joints of mob history, noir films, hard-boiled paperbacks, and two-fisted pulp fiction with mystery writer and make-believe detective Stephen Gomez. Grab your fedora and button your lip as you enter the office of the internet's finest fictional detective agency, the Noir Factory.
A pulp story without a detective, and obviously somebody for him to do battle with, is unthinkable. And I can't remember reading a pulp story that didn't have a dame, either a good girl or a bad girl. Otto Penzler. The 1890s in Europe was, for all intent and purposes, a golden age for serialized stories in print. In England, Charles Dickens became the first rock star the world had ever seen. And in France, serialized versions of the Three Musketeers and the Count of Monte Cristo were spread out over hundreds of installments, making their publishers wealthy. In one case, a German novel published in serialized form for Die Gartenlaube catapulted their circulation to over 350,000 readers in 1875. The public was hungry for serialized literature, and the novel, thanks to writers such as Dickens and Wilkie Collins, was still in its infancy. Put those two facts together, and you were truly onto something. In 1890, George Newnes and editor H. Greenhough Smith founded the Strand Magazine, named for a fashionable London area. The goal of the magazine was to elevate storytelling and discourse, and it attempted to appeal to a mass-market family readership. From the start, the magazine featured a mix of factual articles, short stories, and serialized fiction. For each issue published, George Newnes had a goal of every page having at least one picture. In 1891, this proved not only to be difficult, but expensive as well. Both photography and engraving were new and pricey at the time. From the start, a popular feature of the magazine was Perplexities, a puzzle column that ranged from difficult to maddening. It was created by mathematician and English author Henry Duddendy, who wrote the column and was considered the country's leading expert on mathematical problems. The monthly magazine was well received from the start, and the slogan for the Strand was, "A monthly magazine costing 6 pence but worth a shilling." Early in the Strand's run, the magazine ran A Scandal in Bohemia by Arthur Conan Doyle. Doyle had already published 2 Sherlock Holmes novels, A Study in Scarlet and The Sign of Four, and the books had done respectably. As one reviewer said, Dr. Doyle's admirers will read the little volume through eagerly enough, but they will hardly care to take it up again. But it was the Holmes short stories featured in the Strand that truly caught fire with the reading public. Circulation rose immediately with A Scandal in Bohemia, and Doyle found a literary home. From 1891 to 1927, over 56 Holmes stories were featured in the Strand magazine, and most were skillfully illustrated by Sidney Paget. In truth, Doyle had actually sought the Strand out as a place that would do justice to his detective. In his autobiography, Doyle had written that a number of monthly magazines were coming out at the time, notable amongst which was the Strand, under the very capable editorship of Greenhough Smith. Considering these various journals with their disconnected stories, it had struck me that a single character running through a series, if only engaging the attention of the reader, would bind that reader to a particular magazine. Looking around for my central character, I felt that Sherlock Holmes, who had already handled in 2 little books, would easily lend himself to a succession of short stories. Doyle's fame and fortune rose quickly, as did the Strand's. Doyle published stories in the magazine continuously, and scarcely an issue went to press without a contribution from him. From 1891 until his death in 1930, Sherlock Holmes stories along with Professor Challenger stories, historic fiction, and even interviews with the man himself graced the pages of the Strand. It was estimated that the serialized version of The Hound of the Baskervilles from 1901 to the following year increased the magazine's circulation by over 30,000. But Arthur Conan Doyle was by no means the only literary giant to grace the pages of the Strand. Graham Greene, J.K. Chesterton, Leo Tolstoy, and P.G. Wodehouse all contributed. Even Winston Churchill contributed an article or two to the Strand. A drawing of Queen Victoria was printed in the Strand, drawn by one of her children, with the Queen's permission, of course. In addition to its literary pedigree, the Strand was also the home for new detective fiction, from the likes of Agatha Christie, Edgar Wallace, Dorothy Sayers, and Georges Simenon. The turn of the century was a golden time for detective literature, as well as short stories, but golden ages can only last so long. With the start of World War II, paper, as well as many goods, were being rationed, and the size of the magazine had to be decreased. Costs rose, readership fell, and the Strand was never able to recover. By 1950, the Strand needed £250,000 to recover, a sum the owners felt they had no way of raising. In March of that year, the Strand was forced to stop publication. But somewhere, across the pond, another literary voice was beginning to make waves. It's past midnight on a dark, rainy night. For hours you've been trying to sleep, tossing and turning, but the peace and bliss that Morpheus brings eludes you. Your mind betrays you as quick, desperate thoughts dart in and out of your head. There's much to do tomorrow, too much, but sleep still eludes you. Suddenly, out of nowhere, there's a tapping at your door, as slow and deliberate as death itself. You reach for your robe and you stumble your way to the front door, all the while frantically wondering who would possibly intrude at this hour of the morning. You reach the front door, and there is no one. On a worn, ironic welcome mat lies a piece of paper, crumpled and used. You open the scrap, and on it is scrawled the words, "Find your contact." You look down the road, into a foggy abyss, and you wonder, what could this message mean? Relax, it's just us at the Noir Factory reminding you that we're on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Friend us, follow us, or Instagram us for the best in noir stories, hard-boiled fiction, and historical crime. Also, let us know what you'd like to see, and we'll do our best to comply. But a nice, crisp Andrew Jackson tucked into a handshake can go a long way. So again, connect with us and let us know what you like. But for now, relax and get some rest. But first, we return you to today's crime, already in progress. Hard-boiled crime fiction came of age in Black Mask magazine during the 20s and 30s. Writers like Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler learned their craft and developed a distinct literary style and attitude towards the modern world. Charles Frazier. If it was the early 1900s and you were H.L. Mencken, you had problems. Mencken was a German-American born in the U.S., and he would go on to be one of the most important writers and English-language scholars of the earliest 20th century. Mencken was a linguistic genius who made important, if not always fair or just, social commentaries, and he became known for a multi-volume study of the English language as used by Americans. He eventually came to be known as the Sage of Baltimore, and wrote editorials and opinion pieces in the Baltimore Sun. Around 1916, Mencken, along with his partner George John Nathan, a talented drama critic, co-edited The Smart Set, a literary magazine that offered ambitious newcomers a voice to the American public. It turned out, however, that the American public didn't really care for that sort of thing. By April of 1920, The Smart Set was in trouble. The magazine was losing money, a lot of money. Mencken and Nathan had already published 2 side publications to bail Smart Set out. The first was Parisien, and it was followed up by Saucy Stories, a publication that followed the misadventures of an erotic stable hand. The publication built itself as 5 magazines in one, the best stories available of adventure, the best mystery and detective stories, the best romances, the best love stories, and the best stories of the occult. It wasn't the best of any of these things. What they produced in that first issue were standard stories of the time. They were completely unmemorable and completely unremarkable. The few pages of detective stories in the magazines were derivative of English mysteries, and there was nothing of note about the magazine, except its name, The Black Mask. Macon and Nathan made it through 8 issues of The Black Mask, all the while making Smart Set their true priority. A few months later, they sold The Black Mask for $12,500, more than doubling their initial investment, and set sail for more literary seas. But now, The Black Mask was owned by Eltonage Warner and Eugene Crow. The magazine focused on hard-boiled crime and a new school of tough crime writers, and the man who ushered that school in was editor Joseph Shaw. Shaw was a failed short story writer who used connections to land a job editing a magazine he didn't really know much about. Nonetheless, he knew what he expected in this story. He wanted to see clarity and plausibility. He was a meat and potatoes guy who expected the same in his stories. Shaw wrote editorials for the magazine about such issues as the legal system and gun control. He believed that a good crime story should hold an underlying moral center and should end in justice, even if the law should fail. In part, that view was a reflection of the society's views of the police. Law enforcement was increasingly mistrusted by the public, and Shaw saw the private eye as an agent of justice, where the police forced an uneven and unreliable law. In May of 1923, The Black Mask published Three Gun Terry by Carol John Daly. I have a little office which says Terry Mack, Private Investigator on the door, which means whatever you wish to think. I ain't a crook, and I ain't a dick. I play the game on the level, in my own way. That could have been the private investigator prayer. Instead, it set the table for other writers. Daly followed up Terry Mack with Race Williams, a wise-talking sleuth who was comfortable with casual violence. That recipe was popular with the public, and it struck a chord with editor Shaw as well. In 1927, he published an editorial where he wrote that detective fiction, as we see, has only commenced to be deployed. All other fields have been worked and overworked, but detective fiction has barely been scratched. Doubling down on this philosophy, The Black Mask dropped all other genres from the magazine and focused on printing and developing hard-boiled writers. They hit it big with an ex-Pinkerton writer who seemed to have hard-boiled fiction by the throat. That writer, Dashiell Hammett, created such characters for The Black Mask as Sam Spade and the Continental Op. Hammett was joined in the pages of The Black Mask by writers such as Earl Stanley Gardner, Raymond Chandler, and Hugh B. Cave, and for many years, the magazine followed that course. In 1936, Joseph Shaw was let go, and the owners of The Black Mask hired Fanning Ellsworth to steer the ship. Ellsworth was an accomplished editor, and she had her own vision for the magazine. The Black Mask still focused on crime, but the mood of the stories underwent a change. Ellsworth enjoyed complex storytelling and liked to bring humor and emotion. Shaw had always been uncomfortable with overt emotions in his story. Ellsworth also saw this as a chance to bring in new young writers with a fresh perspective. She gave writers such as Cornell Woolrich, Max Brand, Frank Gruber, and Steve Fisher an early home. The Black Mask gave their stories unusual protagonists and darker storylines. Justice wasn't always the outcome, and darkness was inherent. The stories of Woolrich and Fisher made their way to the big screen, and soon so did they. The writers of The Black Mask made their way to Hollywood to write scripts for movies such as Rear Window, I Wake Up Screaming, Fear the Night, and I Wouldn't Be in Your Shoes. In their own way, the writers and editors of The Black Mask paved the way for noir and film noir in America, and they laid out an art form that still thrives today. After the 40s, however, sales of The Black Mask declined, and in 1951, it ceased publication altogether. But not all was over for either the Strand or The Black Mask. In 1985, The Black Mask was revived as The New Black Mask, where the works of such legendary writers as James Ellroy and Sarah Paretsky were featured. In 1998, The Strand was brought back into publication as a quarterly, and included stories by greats like Ray Bradbury, Alexander McCall Smith, and Edward Hawke. And in both cases, it goes to prove that great storytelling voices will always find an audience. Well, that closes the books on this case of the Noir Factory. Join us next time when we look at the wrong side of the tracks in noir, crime, and hard-boiled stories. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe to iTunes and leave an honest review. And come by the website at www.noirfactory.com and fill up on the best of pulpy and hard-boiled goodness. And remember, nice guys finish last.
Still there? This week's special Noir Factory Dakota message is coming right up. Crack the code by visiting thenoirfactory.com/key.
20, 10, 22, 3, 3, 16, 17, 2, 23, 22, 22, 21. That is all. For the key to this code, go to thenoirfactory.com/key. Good night.